a coordinated infrastructure attack that unfolded not over weeks or days, but in 17 minutes. 17 minutes that plunged 43 million people across 11 countries into darkness. 17 minutes that disabled critical hospital systems, traffic networks, and emergency response communications. 17 minutes that brought the European power grid to the edge of total collapse. What Putin's cyber command did today crossed a line that Western intelligence had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with lethality, and with a protocol that international law had explicitly forbidden them from using. For 8 months now, there had been warnings, not from official government statements, not from formal intelligence briefings, just quiet warnings from cybersecurity researchers and infrastructure monitoring groups that Russia was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive in cyberspace, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a doctrine. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels and Washington this past week was that the rhythm went silent. Experts who monitor Russian cyber activity know the indicators, the reconnaissance probes against power substations, the phishing campaigns targeting energy sector employees, the distributed denial of service tests on financial networks, the sudden withdrawal of Russian diplomatic families from targeted countries. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early this morning, European grid security detected what they described as synchronized malware detonation across critical infrastructure nodes, including attack vectors that had not been observed in active deployment in over 14 years. These are the kinds of cyber weapons that Russia only activates when they are signaling something very specific: retaliation, escalation, or the beginning of a new phase of warfare. NATO cyber defense teams didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts its strategic posture without explanation, even by a single degree, the entire international community pays attention. The emergency directive issued by the European Council tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after classified briefing described Russia's attack as disproportionate, indiscriminate, and perhaps most importantly, designed to cause cascading civilian harm in a way that violated every international norm Russia had publicly committed to respecting. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive and technically sophisticated we've seen in modern conflict. Here's what we know. Within 42 minutes of the initial blackout wave, Ukraine activated Protocol Zircon. These weren't the standard cyber countermeasures. These were offensive digital weapons, systems and code that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to strike critical Russian state infrastructure in ways that cannot be easily reversed. Tonight, Ukrainian Cyber Command confirmed that they launched precision digital strikes on 12 hardened targets inside Russian territory, including the Zelenigrad microelectronics facility that had recently been designated as critical national infrastructure for what analysts believe was Russia's domestic semiconductor production program. Ukraine struck before Russia could activate secondary attack waves. They hit the cooling systems at the Balakovo nuclear power plant, forcing emergency shutdown protocols. They hit the automated switching stations controlling natural gas flow to China through the Power of Siberia pipeline. They hit the backup command servers that were likely preparing to support follow-on attacks against Ukrainian air defense networks. In other words, Ukraine targeted infrastructure interdependence, the exact components that would have made Russia's next phase operational. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Russia's blackout attack wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could destabilize European security architecture if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that, fully responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't hit civilian apartment buildings, they didn't hit hospitals or schools. They hit dual-use infrastructure that feeds Russia's war machine. They hit the economic leverage points that Putin uses to fund continued aggression. And here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of European resolve after 3 consecutive months of declining military aid to Ukraine. Russia wanted to see whether European governments would fracture under the pressure of mass blackouts and civilian panic, but instead, the opposite happened. European leaders didn't demand Ukrainian restraint. They issued a joint statement that was so unified, so forceful, that even Moscow's propaganda channels went silent for 17 minutes, trying to craft a response. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but today Ukraine did. Senior defense analysts speaking with Reuters under anonymity described Russia's attack as strategic probing, a way to identify fracture points in the Western alliance. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only technically sophisticated, they were timed so precisely that Russian emergency responders were still mobilizing when the second wave of Ukrainian attacks disabled their encrypted communication systems. That timing matters because it shows operational intelligence at the highest level. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian aggression, they are anticipating it, shaping it, and countering it with strategic initiative. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian cyber units carried out simultaneous denial-of-service attacks on 17 Russian government websites, forcing the Kremlin to redirect internet traffic through Chinese servers. Ukrainian intelligence targeted 3 data centers in Moscow that had been upgraded with military-grade electromagnetic shielding in the last 8 months. Ukrainian special operations forces operating inside Russian territory reportedly destroyed fiber-optic trunk lines used by the Russian Ministry of Defense to communicate with forward-deployed nuclear early warning systems. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just symbolic defiance, this was strategic degradation, this was calculated disruption of Russia's ability to sustain complex military operations. And strategic degradation is the one thing Russia has struggled to defend against since the beginning of the war. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Russia's ability to hold, supply, or defend that territory. Remember, Russia thought this would be over in 72 hours. They thought Europe would fracture under energy pressure. They thought Ukraine would collapse without constant Western support. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking Russian territory with precision. Europe is more unified than it has been in decades, and Russia is struggling to explain to its own population why the lights are going out in Moscow. What makes this moment so dangerous and so unpredictable is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Hardliners in the Security Council want full mobilization. Oligarchs want de-escalation and sanctions relief. Regional governors want resources to fix crumbling infrastructure. The military wants modern equipment and clear strategic objectives. Putin is balancing these demands while managing an economy that has shrunk by 11% in 18 months. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. NATO's emergency communique, now circulating among all 32 member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to tolerate attacks on critical civilian infrastructure as a legitimate tool of warfare. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's Blackout operation was inconsistent with the laws of armed conflict and the basic principles of proportionality. That is diplomatic language for you just committed a war crime and we documented every bite of it. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the nation in a brief, unflinching speech tonight. He said, "They tried to turn off our lights. We answered by shutting down their war machine." He said, "Every attack on our people will be met not with fear, but with precision. And he said, "We did not start this war, but we will define how it is fought." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the infrastructure blackout, Belarus also mobilized 3 reserve battalions to the Ukrainian border. Russian naval forces increased submarine activity in the North Atlantic, targeting undersea communication cables, Wagner Group affiliates, increased social media disinformation campaigns targeting German and French elections. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a major new offensive in eastern Ukraine, timed to coincide with winter. Another is that Russia is attempting to force negotiations by demonstrating the pain they can inflict on European civilians. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to provoke a Ukrainian overreaction that would fracture NATO unity and justify Russian escalation. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't strike civilian targets. They didn't use disproportionate force. They didn't give Russia the propaganda victory they were looking for. They struck military and dual-use infrastructure with precision and restraint. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if Europe will sacrifice Ukraine to restore its own electricity. Ukraine wants to show that attacks on civilians will be met with strikes on Russian state power. NATO wants to prevent horizontal escalation into direct confrontation with Russia, and China wants to prevent vertical escalation into nuclear brinkmanship that destabilizes global markets. Tonight, we've heard from signals intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian military communications for signs of retaliation. They say Russian strategic rocket forces have not changed alert status. They say Russian bomber patrols have not increased. And they say Russia's decision to launch the Blackout attack is likely part of a pressure campaign intended to weaken European resolve before winter energy demand peaks. But Ukraine is not waiting for permission. In fact, Ukraine is demonstrating operational autonomy. Their response today, swift, targeted, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that civilian infrastructure attacks will be answered with military consequences. And it sent a message to Brussels and Washington that Ukraine will defend itself with or without explicit Allied approval. As the hours go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It degraded Russia's ability to launch follow-on attacks. It demonstrated Ukrainian technical capability at the highest levels, and it shifted the strategic calculus in Kyiv's favor. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a dangerous new phase. If he pulls back, NATO and Ukraine have already shown they are prepared, capable, and willing. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is weighing his options. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times but refuses to accept. Ukraine will not be intimidated. Europe will not fracture under pressure. And attacks on civilians will be met with strikes on the Russian state itself. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine still controls the initiative. Russia is on the defensive, and the world is watching to see whether Moscow has the wisdom to step back from the edge. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.